Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be part of ChefConf Online this year. My name is Yonathan Koren. I'm with Indellient, and Indellient is a principal chef partner and also a specialized HashiCorp partner. And I deal with both ecosystems on a day-to-day basis, and I've dealt with clients that are on Chef Infra for years, and I'm also dealing with clients that are not on Chef Infra and are purely on Chef Habitat. And today I wanted to talk about Effortless, and I wanted to give a very practical overview of Effortless because I found that there are some clients which were ready to jump into Effortless without first creating a roadmap of things they need to do in order to be able to control their infrastructure in the same way that they're doing so with Chef Infra Server. And there are also some customers that are hesitant to go towards Effortless because it's new, because it debuted at around 2019. I'm going to be referencing a very good presentation made by David Eccles in ChefConf 2019, which essentially introduces Chef Effortless, explains what it is, and goes into a lot of depth regarding the technical benefits of Chef Effortless over the traditional Chef Infra approach. But this particular speech is not going to be very technical in terms of the benefits. It's going to talk a lot about technical challenges when it comes to actually adopting Chef Effortless. But it's going to also talk about the organizational benefits of using Chef Effortless. And for anybody, I'm not going to go into too much technical detail, but essentially Chef Effortless is a Habitat package that contains a policy file and cookbook that you've versioned and quote unquote baked in to your Habitat package. And you don't need to manage any of the Chef client run logic. All of that is done for you using a Chef Habitat scaffolding package. All you have to do is version the policy file and cookbook, and you are able to run cookbooks using Chef Habitat. That's essentially it. And when you do that, first of all, we're assuming that your organization is already using Chef Habitat to run applications. So you have Chef Habitat packages for your web application, and you've got a way to configure the underlying infrastructure to run the Chef Habitat supervisor, load the particular service, configure the service, and now you can, on top of that, run the Effortless package. I want to, in the next few slides, explain the organizational benefits of using Chef Effortless, in particular when it comes to collaboration, because I believe that it empowers the developer to see how their application runs in production, but do that in local dev. And I also want to touch on how adopting Chef Habitat and Chef Effortless is just making better use of tooling. So making use of Chef Infra and what it does best, and that's configure things at the system level and tackle any configuration management problem using its rich ecosystem of resources. And with Chef Habitat, a unified approach for rendering configurations for your applications, creating inter-service dependency contracts, managing package application dependencies. That's the pattern created by Chef Habitat, and it's just better built for managing applications. And I want to talk about collaboration, and I'm going to start with a personal example. And you're probably wondering, why are there Kubernetes logos in ChefConf? But this is a personal example for an organization that I used to be part of. as a Kubernetes operator responsible for managing multiple self-managed Kubernetes clusters. And I worked very close to a full stack team. And this particular full stack team were very smart guys who had a perfect understanding of how the application runs in local dev. And even though they knew exactly how their application is meant to be run, they didn't know exactly how it needs or how it actually is being run in production. And the reason being is that they focused on their main area of collaboration, their Git repository for the application. This is where they were working on in their sprints. This is where they were using all their Git branching strategies, and they were purely focused on their codes. And when it comes to deploy, they knew the particular environment variables required for the application. And they would essentially tell me, you know, when you deploy this application, this S3 underscore bucket name variable needs to be set and point to the respective S3 bucket in that environment. But they did not have the same area of collaboration as I did. I was committing to the Helm charts repository, they were committing to their application repository. And even though you could say, if they really wanted to see what was going on here, they could be able to look. The reality is day in and day out, this is their area to work. So whenever they would commit, it would build a Docker image and push it to a registry. I would have to reference it in the Helm chart that they would pretty much never see. And that Helm chart was used to deploy to the particular Kubernetes clusters. And whenever there was a problem in production, for example, they would have to trace back my decisions and see, you know, is X configured properly? Is Y configured properly? And it wasn't one environment variable. There were 46 or 47 of them, if I remember correctly. And unfortunately, I think that Chef Infra, in the classic sense, creates a similar problem. And let's just pretend that the application in a organization is the same as the application in the Kubernetes shop. The developer is still focused on their main area for collaboration with their team, which is this repository, and they will commit to it. It'll build a particular artifact that is then managed by the application-specific cookbook. And this cookbook is responsible for configuring the application and running it. And typically, there are the operators in the organization, or at least the ones that I've seen, that are experts at Chef, that have multiple repositories for cookbooks that do governance or OS hardening, and they're also managing all the Chef server objects, so the node objects, the environment objects, roles that will have the attributes that are then fed into, that are then going to be used by the application-specific cookbook to run the said application. And again, in this particular case, you have the throwing over the wall scenario, where you are relying on somebody else to configure your application when it runs in prod. You can also argue that there are developers that are specialized and are actually the ones responsible for creating these application-specific cookbooks. And I've literally seen this as well. But why are you teaching a developer how to use a tool for configuring infrastructure to configure their application? And why are you not able to enable your developer to easily run the application as it would in prod, but in local dev? In the Kubernetes shop, we actually solved this problem. We solved it by creating a unified area of collaboration where your local dev feels and works very close to what production is. So there is actually a tool called Scaffold for Kubernetes that allows you to run Helm charts on Minikube, which is just a localized Kubernetes cluster that can run on your laptop. And so the developer doesn't have to then throw things over the wall and tell me, hey, like you need to render this S3 bucket name environment variable using Helm. They can literally do that themselves and they can validate it. And the other side of the coin is that me as an operator, I can actually see that if they're using the Kubernetes objects properly, we're both working in the same plane. So you could have a project-specific Git repository for this that contains the Helm charts, that contains the application, and they'll commit to it. And you could use the tool. So it'll have a pipeline to build the Docker image and upload it to the registry. And you could use a tool like Flux CD to pull down these particular Helm charts and deploy to Kubernetes, your Kubernetes clusters. And I was alluding to using a better tool for managing your applications. So instead of having to create custom cookbooks that will render out a file to configure your application, you're actually able to do that inherently with Chef Habitat. So you have different types of values, default values, and you can override them at the machine level or at the service level. And whenever you reapply the configuration, it'll restart the application with the new configuration rendered into a file. So you have a unified way of doing that, which is the same in your local dev, it's the same in QA, and it's the same in prod. But you also have more advanced features that are going to be hard to replicate in your application-specific cookbook, like ensuring that application A doesn't start until application B comes up. And you can also transparently manage all of your dependencies for your application. For example, you can make sure that the JRE is installed for your application. And you can also manage what happens when the application initializes for the first time and what happens when it needs to run. So you're able to manage its lifecycle using hooks. And for anybody who hasn't used the Chef Habitat Studio, this is simply what it looks like after you build it and load your application. And I don't want to preach to the choir because I'm sure a lot of us have seen Habitat. But I just really wanted to emphasize the importance of local development and that being a missing piece prior to Chef Habitat. And where Effortless comes in is, let's say in your project, you're using Chef Habitat to load your services. So like I said, it assumes that there is already use of Chef Habitat. You've already figured out how to manage your Chef Habitat supervisors, how to load the services, how to configure them. You can empower your developer to then, in the same project, create this is both the developer and the operator working together in the same project. They're able to create an Effortless package which will reference cookbooks, either inline or actually coming from cookbooks that are already built for the organization. Let's say there's organization-wide cookbooks being used for hardening or for governance. You could use those, but the developer is actually able to replicate what production is going to look like locally. The caveat being that if you're using the Chef Habitat Studio, you are probably not going to be able to run a lot of the underlying OS configuration cookbooks because it's a very minimal image that uses, like when you just enter the Habitat Studio, you just have BusyBox and you have the Habitat supervisor running, and that's about it. So you are going to need to spin up a Vagrant box for CentOS 7 or RHEL if you want to really replicate what production looks like. But then you can load what in my org we actually call Chef Base, and this is the Effortless package that contains the base cookbooks for OS hardening, for any governance items like agents that need to do reporting, and then you can actually run the application or applications specific to your project. The nice thing here, and this is the analogy that I'm bridging between Kubernetes and Chef, is that the developer doesn't need to tell me how to configure the application. They can literally do that. And when they're doing that, in this particular case, imagine in the run hook of the application, if it uses environment variables, it exports this particular environment variable using the Chef Habitat configuration. They're able to do that themselves. And me as an operator, if we're working in the same area of collaboration, the same repository, we're able to reference some of the general cookbooks for OS hardening, and we're able to do that properly the way I want it. So we're able to work together. This is breaking down that wall that we were alluding to earlier. And we can commit to the Git repository. And the pipelines are actually very simple with Chef Habitat because you just create the Habitat package, and then you have your pipeline creates a Habitat package, it uploads it, and you could have separate pipelines for promoting to QA to a QA channel, for example, or a prod channel. And those can live in the same repository as well. I've seen that too. And these Chef Habitat supervisors are listening to the QA channel. So they're polling it every minute, and they will download the new package when it comes in. So you have a very simplified CI/CD for Chef Habitat packages that, and in this particular case with cookbooks, it actually mimics the environment cookbook pattern without having to do locking or managing any of that. You can do that transparently using Chef Habitat, and you can work together. I took the liberty of quoting somebody from Chef Habitat forum in a post that comes from 2018. And I think it just does a great job at summarizing why Chef Habitat was made. And again, I can't emphasize enough that Chef Infra has an amazing track record, and it's great, absolutely great for managing, for tackling any configuration management problem, but there's a lot of overhead that you have to do for managing the application side of things. Overhead that is solved transparently with Chef Habitat. And you can see in the features such as binds, templating, application dependency management, that Chef Habitat was created as a direct replacement for these shortcomings to reduce this overhead and to keep it consistent. And this just reiterates that Chef Habitat has those modern application automation features that are especially useful for modern service-oriented architecture. You can see here a run hook with templating, and Chef Infra is an absolutely rich ecosystem for Chef resources that will help you tackle any configuration management problem you need to solve. So that's a really great narrative. We can get the best of both worlds, right? If we start with Chef Habitat and we bring Chef Infra into the mix whenever we need underlying OS configuration, we can get the two experts in each domain to do their job, right? But this is where I tell some of my clients to slow down and think, what are you using Chef Infra for? What are some of the features that are currently very important in your organization's infrastructure that you're using? And how are you going to replace that when you get rid of Chef Infra Server? One of the main differences that I see between Chef Infra and Chef Effortless is that Chef Infra can give you a whole source of truth. If you, aside from the default attributes in the cookbooks, you can have the chef server objects repository that all your node objects, your environment objects, your roles, they can tell you what attributes are being used to feed in um, to feed to the cookbooks that you're running. But Chef Effortless, it doesn't have that. You are baking in a policy file that can have and that can potentially tell you some things about the run of the Chef Effortless package, and you can have the default attributes in the cookbooks. But when you want to override that at the machine level, when you want to override that at the environment level, it's not versioned anywhere necessarily. You have to make sure that if you're doing a habconfig apply or if you're supplying a user toml, you have that source of truth somewhere. Otherwise, you're going to be missing out what Chef Infra gives you. If you're using data bags for managing secrets, you can store those on the Chef server. But with Chef Effortless, your data bags have to be essentially baked into the Chef Habitat package, the immutable Effortless package. And you can have a data bag item for UAT, for prod, for dev, but you also need to bootstrap the encryption secret in order to decrypt it. And you can make that specific to the item. So that way you can say, well, even though I'm running this Effortless package in development, and it contains the data bag item for prod in it, it's baked into it, it's encrypted and doesn't have the encryption secret. But that's probably bound to get some looks from people in your organization. So it's definitely a loss there. And also, I was alluding to this a little bit before, if you want to have an environment level attribute for your instances, that's inherent with Chef Infra, with environments. But with Effortless, you have to do that with Chef Habitat. So you can peer a bunch of Chef Habitat supervisors as part of a ring, and then load the Effortless packages in a particular service group, and then do a habconfig apply to that service group, right? But that's not something that's version necessarily, and that is custom. It's not inherent. So you have to be aware of that if you're going to use that. The most important shortcoming, I think, with Chef Effortless is that you need to manage the Chef Habitat supervisors. You need to manage what loads the services, what configures the services for the instance or at the environment level or the service group level. But if you're getting rid of Chef Server, you need something to fill that gap now. So just to reiterate, when I say managing the Habitat side of things, it involves installing Habitat and also accepting the license, managing the Habitat supervisor daemons. If you're going to be actually creating the ring architecture and saying, well, these particular, this set of 10 instances are part of a ring because I want them communicating to each other so I can have service groups, or if I want a permanent peer that they will always try to communicate to, and this peer is the instance that I do habconfig applies against as a single gate for configuring the Chef Habitat supervisor ring, then you need to do all that yourself. You need to load the Effortless service, and you need to load your application services. And again, I think this is something I mentioned probably twice before already. You can modify things, modify the attributes used by the Effortless package or the applications themselves, if you're just talking about Chef Habitat applications with user tomls or habconfig applies, and you should definitely version that. And I think that's a big oversight that I've seen a lot of clients do, is they forget to version it, and then they need to go in and query the Chef Habitat supervisor and see what's actually going on in that environment. We've actually been able to fill this gap with Terraform, and it has a few caveats. So it's not perfect. I don't want you thinking that this is, oh, okay, there's a solution for this. It's a very obvious solution, and I'm going to be using Terraform. In fact, I think even the David Eccles 2019 presentation showed a remote exec with Terraform. So the remote exec, so remote exec is a provisioner. Right here, we're using the Habitat provisioner. Remote exec is just whenever you create a resource with Terraform, you're able to run a shell script. So what he did is he installed Habitat, and he loaded the Effortless package as a service. And in this case, we're using the Habitat provisioner. And this is a built-in provisioner with Terraform. So all you need is a Terraform binary. And this actually installs the Habitat supervisor. This accepts the license. You can manage auto updates. You could manage your peers, talk to a permanent peer, you can define whether or not this is a permanent peer. And you are also able to load the Chef Habitat services, and you're able to configure them using a user toml. Now, the main caveat here is that these provisioners, and I think this applies to not only Terraform, but if you're also using something like user data on AWS, you are essentially going to be facing a black box, because these provisioning tools only care about what happens in the beginning. They don't reconcile with the Habitat supervisor after the fact, right? That's something that Chef Infra would be very good at, right? To make sure that idempotently you get the configuration that you want. But these tools, if you're trying to move away from Chef Infra from Chef Infra's server, and you're not trying to use Chef Infra to configure the main driver of the configuration, which is now Habitat, you're going to be facing this black box scenario if you're going to be using a provisioner to fill that gap, because provisioners only care about what happens at creation time. Now, with Terraform specifically, you can supply user tomls, but you are not supplying a service level configuration using a habconfig apply. So it's going to be machine specific, and if you want service group level configurations, you need to do all that yourself. And I'm not sure if I mentioned it before, but you can create a pipeline that versions the particular configuration that is going to be habconfig applied, and then apply it to the bastion ring. So one of the bastions in the bastion ring, you can, if you're not familiar with that term, you can look up Chef Habitat bastion ring pattern. But those are the permanent peers that the other supervisors are talking to, and that's how you'd be versioning and applying your habconfig apply. But all of that is custom. The main thing that I've seen that really puts you in a pickle is some organizations are on-prem and are relying solely on Chef Infra. So one of the organizations that I've seen is whenever they want a new instance, they go to the IT team and they say, hey, we need an instance. We want in this particular subnet, and we wanted to give it this host name, right? And the IT team then bootstraps Chef client and make sure it talks to Chef server. And then they have the Chef server objects where they map that new instance via its host name, and be able to map it to an environment and hence feed in the attributes and whatnot. But that's pretty much their only way of configuring that instance, because really all it is bootstrap via for Chef server. So ironically, if you're going to be going towards the effortless route in this scenario, you need Chef Infra to, install Chef Habitat, to load the Effortless package, to configure the Effortless package and the other Habitat packages. And the main thing that I've seen is that Effortless is open-ended. There are different ways of doing it. For example, I've loaded the Effortless package alongside other Chef Habitat services. So in particular, I was talking about naming your Chef Effortless package Chef Base for all the OS hardening and the governance cookbooks, and you can load it alongside your Chef Habitat package for your web application. I've also created an Effortless package which contains a services cookbook, which relies on the Chef Habitat resources and is able to load the other Chef Habitat services and actually configure them. But you get this nested configuration, which some people may or may not want. We've used Terraform in our particular organization to do the provisioning. And that does come with the caveat of the black box scenario that I mentioned before. And you can also use Chef Infra to load the Effortless Chef Habitat package and also the Effortless package, which I've done this as well in that particular organization that relied on Chef Infra for anything. But then you get into the question of why am I, if I need Chef Infra to then load Habitat, which runs Chef Infra, why am I creating a cycle? Why don't I just keep going with my mature paradigm of using Chef Infra, right? And that's valid. Maybe they need to stay on it. I'm not sure what their decision is going to be in a few months, but that's completely valid too, right? My point here is that it's highly dependent on your situation, how you're driving your configuration for your infrastructure. How much are you dependent on Chef Server currently? And whether or not the collaboration benefits that I was describing and the technical benefits, which you can go to tinyurl.com/effortless2019 and watch the 50-minute long video from 2019 and look at all the technical benefits. Is that something you want to pursue? All right, so that's the main thing, is you need to consider these things before jumping towards Effortless. And the last thing, I think I mentioned it for the fourth time now, is please, whenever using Habitat, whenever using Chef Effortless, version your configs. Find a way to do that. So as a summary, Effortless gets rid of Chef Server. It keeps some of its objects, but some of its components, but it gets rid of most of this components, and just allows Chef Habitat to run the cookbooks. It replaces the environment cookbook pattern with Chef Habitat channels, which can simplify pipelines. Your workflow might be a lot nicer now that you're dealing with a repository that has the Chef Habitat logic and it has the Effortless logic loading those particular cookbooks. That might be something you really want to do, but there's definitely a trade-off because you are now responsible for the underlying configuration of the Chef Habitat supervisor and its services, and you need to map that out before you start going this route. And I'm going to leave this time for just some Q&A. If you are watching the recorded version of this, you can always email me at yonathan.koren@indellient.com. You can also reach out to Indellient. I left Indellent's contact here. And my other company, ShuttleOps, which is part of Indellient. And you can find me on GitHub at YonKorenLove. That's my handle. So hopefully that gives you a more practical overview of Chef Effortless right now. And I'm going to leave this time for live Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have one question already.
Okay.
And this one's kind of interesting. Yeah. So would you consider an antivirus product an application or system configuration? And how would you suggest handling it within the context of Chef Infra, Habitat, and Effortless?
That's a great question. I've never had to deal with an antivirus, but I've dealt with multiple governance agents. And I've actually opted for the Effortless side of things. So we create a cookbook for installing the said agent and running it. For example, we were all on CentOS boxes for this particular client. And so we had a cookbook to install the RPM package provided by the vendor and load the agent through via system D. And the reason why the cookbook was really nice is because we had the idempotency of knowing, okay, well, we have these instances that we manage for the client, and there's also some other one-off instances that the client manages. So they follow the vendor instructions and they install this agent and they loaded it, and they may have gone into a couple of machines as well and tried to load it in their dev environment, for example. But with the cookbooks, we just have these recipes which are idempotent and just say we need this RPM package installed and we need the service loaded. And it was very easy to follow the vendor instructions as well because they provide the RPM package. And I think that's better than deconstructing it and packaging it towards Habitat with Habitat, even though Habitat in some cases is appropriate for COTS applications. I would definitely go with the cookbook and the Effortless route for vendor supplied antiviruses, agents for governance reporting and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those kinds of applications end up having like downstream consumers that expect things to be in a certain place, right? So like your compliance scanner might get confused if things aren't set up exactly the way they're supposed to.
That's true as well. That's true as well.
All right. Does anybody else have any other good questions? We have some experience here for some crazy stuff with Habitat. So if you have any questions, now's a good time to ask them. I think we did have one that got answered in a later slide about user TOMLs, so we're good there. For folks who haven't seen last year's sort of intro to effortless config, we have I posted the link to that in the channel. It was in one of the earlier slides as well. So you have that background there. Yep. From EcoHack. Anything else, folks? Oh, here we go. Let's see. Is using Effortless for, say, 7 or more governance agents something you've seen?
7 or more. I want to say that's a big number, but in the more mature organization I've dealt with, they had a number of. So some of them were for governance reporting. Some of them was for some of the agents were for governance reporting. Some of them were for logging. Some of them were for also like application tracing. And they were heading towards Effortless, but they ran into the particular problem that I mentioned with them using Chef Infra for everything. So I would imagine if they didn't run into that problem, they would have just used their existing cookbooks and load them and probably figure it out. And I don't see a problem with doing that. I think that your Effortless package can be as simple or as complicated as you make it to be. You just have to be careful where you're loading it and if it's going to succeed, right? So let's say, no, I think that with Chef Infra, the resources in many cases are smart enough to handle different operating system distributions. I think that you're probably not going to run into a problem, but definitely if you're packing everything into Effortless, right? As a conversion, I'm saying, well, I'm running these there's these 7 cookbooks I need to use for these 7 governance agents. It's probably best to try an iterative approach than try and packing it all at once. That's probably the only thing I would say. But I haven't seen it. I've seen somebody move towards it. I don't think there's going to be a huge problem with that.
Cool. Super interesting. Yeah. All right. Anything else, folks? No. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Yonathan, for your session.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.